Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar, Ultra-Processed Foods and Health. I'm Amber Valvano, a member of the Wegmans marketing team, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Please note that information provided during today's webinar is for educational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute or a replacement for medical advice, medical nutrition therapy, or individualized nutrition counseling. I will be rejoining you at the end to moderate our Q&A, and I'm now pleased to introduce your presenter, Kirby Branciforte, registered dietitian and Wegmans Nutritionist. Take it away, Kirby.
Thank you so much, Amber, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us today to talk about ultra-processed foods. You might have noticed there have been lots of recent media headlines and articles really starting to highlight the connection between ultra-processed foods and our health. So what we want to do today is really give you a nice overview of this topic and give you some takeaways and some action items that you might consider if this kind of resonates with you. We'll kind of define what ultra-processed foods are, give you some examples, talk about that health effect, and give you some solutions if you want to kind of put some new things into action for yourself. But I will say, before we even get started, please know that this is not an all or nothing conversation. Today, we're going to give you context so that you can kind of do an assessment and decide what types of changes, if any, you want to make. So again, this is not all or nothing, but hopefully will help you make some sense of what you've been maybe seeing out there. Let's start with this big question: what are ultra-processed foods? Unfortunately, we actually don't have a consensus on a single definition. In fact, the idea of ultra-processed foods has been around since 2009. It's different than processed foods, and we'll kind of get into the differences in a bit. But it's a relatively new concept, and we just don't have an agreed upon definition for them. What I have here are just some examples of some ways people have talked about them when I did a quick internet search. And certainly some kind of alarmist language there when we say, oh, they're like Frankenstein's monsters. So we can certainly see why some folks might have a little trepidation there. Now, I will say, although there's not a single definition everybody is using, I personally like to think of that last bullet when people are trying to say, like, how can I differentiate ultra-processed foods from others, by asking a simple question: can you recreate this in your home? If you cannot, it might be a good indication that it is an ultra-processed food. And again, because there's not a definition for it, we can't say definitively if it is or is not. But I like this one because it's just a quick glance test to give you a sense of how they're a little bit different. And again, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily good or bad if you cannot, if you consider them an ultra-processed food, which again, we'll get into, but it's just a quick way to kind of discern them. Now, when we're thinking about the research that's been done around ultra-processed foods, when we want to kind of answer the question, what is the connection between these foods and our health? We do kind of need a common language to talk about them and to look at them. And that language that most folks, most researchers are using is called NOVA. Now, NOVA is a classification system, and you might even see it in some of the articles if you've been reading about them. And that was introduced in 2010, right after the idea of ultra-processed foods were introduced. It was the same group of researchers out of Brazil that first said, hey, we should look at these foods. The next year, they introduced this classification system called NOVA. And again, it's not an agreed upon necessarily definition, but it's the one that we'll use to kind of have a common way to talk about these foods. If we look at NOVA, again, it's a classification system that classifies them based on the extent, so how much, and the purpose. So why was that processing done? It is the most widely used in research. There's been hundreds, if not maybe thousands of, or at least over 1,000 research studies done using this system. And really what it does is it breaks foods into 4 different categories. So NOVA categories 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we'll take a look at those now so you can kind of get a sense of the difference. First category, NOVA category 1, is whole and minimally processed foods. So these have been slightly altered so they can maybe be more easily stored, prepared, or eaten. A really simple way to think about this is that it's a subtraction process. So you're just taking things away, not adding. So think of just removing inedible parts of something. An example of this would be chickpeas. chickpeas need to be dried so that we can eat them. That's a minimal level of processing. So they would be considered NOVA category 1. And we're actually going to follow kind of the life cycle of chickpea processing along the way here. Now, NOVA category 2 is processed culinary ingredients. So these have been processed using techniques like milling, pressing, refining, grinding, and they're really just ingredients that will be used in other foods. They're not typically eaten on their own, with the exception if you're my 7-year-old son, he 100% eats sugar by itself. But outside of that, generally, these are ingredients in other foods. So think of things like salt and oil and sugar and flour, things like that. That brings us to NOVA category 3, which is processed foods. So these are foods that have added sugar, salt, or oil, usually have 2 or 3, maybe a few more ingredients. And you can really think about it as very simply category 2 foods. So those culinary ingredients added to category 1 foods to create a food that's usually ready to be eaten without further preparation. An example of this might be hummus with some oil and spices. That would be a processed food. Now, this brings us to our category 4, NOVA category 4, which is ultra-processed foods. So these foods go kind of beyond, right? Beyond adding salt, sugar, and fat, and they're going to include ingredients like artificial flavors and preservatives, thickeners, emulsifiers, starches, isolated proteins. So truly substances that have been extracted from other foods or synthesized like in a laboratory or in an industrial type of process. So these are kind of a result of a series of processes. Some folks will say that a good way to do a check on these is if there's very little, if any, of the whole intact or minimally processed food from category 1 left. Not always, but if there is not any like visible whole food left, that might be a good indication. Now, an example of this might actually be a hummus with artificial flavors. So now we've gone beyond just a traditional simple preparation and we're including artificial flavors. So some folks, when they registered, asked the question, what are some of the ingredients I might look for? So things like artificial flavors, preservatives, and some of those other ones I mentioned, thickeners, emulsifiers, and things like that. That's going to be an indication that it's an ultra-processed ingredient and therefore potentially an ultra-processed food. So something like a hummus with an artificial flavor, but just because it's considered an ultra-processed food doesn't mean it's bad, right? As a dietitian, I'm certainly going to support if somebody wants to enjoy a hummus with the artificial flavors if they like it more than the processed version. That means they're maybe using it to increase their intake of beans and legumes. Maybe it's replacing another dip. So again, doesn't mean it's bad. Just means it might be considered ultra-processed. But if we further process that same chickpea that was used for the hummus in category 3 and the hummus in category 4, we continue to process that into something like a chickpea chip. Now you can start to see that there can actually be some drastic differences in the types of foods, even within that ultra-processed food category. So even though they had the same starting point with the chickpea, it's a very different ultra-processed food. Now, this chickpea chip might be made from things like isolated starches, maybe from rice or potato. Again, not something you might necessarily find in your home kitchen. And we would maybe consider this something as, maybe consider it like ultra-processed food with what we might say low nutritional value. Doesn't mean it doesn't have other value. Doesn't mean you can't enjoy it. But in terms of nutrition, it's really made up largely of these other ultra-processed components. Can't really see that whole food anymore. You don't really see the chickpea anymore. We wouldn't consider it a chickpea because there's too many other things involved and that it's been processed in a way that kind of removes some of that nutrition. So low nutritional value, but again, not necessarily bad, just different in that category. And it really illustrates that we can't make a blanket statement about all processed foods just by showing this one example. So we really want to make sure folks understand that just ultra processed is not a bad word, but that there are actually differences within that category. So keep this NOVA in mind. We're going to come back to it when we kind of look at the research because a lot of it is based on this classification system. But let's first talk about why we even have these foods, because we want to recognize there was a reason that these all kind of entered our food supply. It wasn't just for fun. There was a reason we did this. One of them is being safety. There's certain processing methods like pasteurization or even the addition of something like an artificial nitrate or nitrate that actually can help to destroy or maybe inhibit the growth of certain harmful bacteria. So there's a safety component there. And then certainly nutrition, we can boost the nutrition of certain items through these ultra-processed methods. And throughout history, we've actually fortified foods with specific nutrients to prevent deficiencies. An example being milk fortified with vitamin D that actually helped with widespread rickets back in the 1920s. So there was some history there. But then if we even just think of today, think of infant formula. That is definitely an ultra-processed food, but absolutely essential for the growth and development of babies who are not breastfed. And convenience, certainly we know that these types of foods add a convenience factor. They're easy to grab and go, they're shelf stable and that type of thing. And then when we look at that last kind of bundle of bullets, so affordability, accessibility, extended shelf life, and food security, what this all boils down to is that processed and ultra-processed food ensure that we have a stable, predictable food supply. So that's certainly something that's beneficial for the whole population. But then when we think about food security in particular, maintaining food and nutrient security is highly important, particularly when you think about individuals who might be accessing an emergency food pantry. Those foods are largely processed or ultra-processed, so they are certainly important in that space. And then when we think about those folks who bring them home, they might not have access to a stove or refrigeration. So we really want to be mindful of the fact that these are not just necessarily a nice to have; they're a need to have for many folks. They count on them for everyday nutrition. So with all of these advantages, we recognize there's a reason and for these foods. What is the concern, right? There is something going on here when we talk about ultra-processed foods and health. That's why we're here today. And when we think about the research that's been done using that NOVA system, we have reached what I would call kind of critical mass. We're reaching a point where we can say pretty much with certainty that the higher intake of ultra-processed foods that you see in a population, you also see a greater risk of certain diseases. Some of them are listed here and conditions, heart disease, type 2 diabetes. And it seems every week I'm starting to see articles. I saw one about early death, stroke, lupus. I've seen some connecting it with cancer. So what we can say pretty much definitively is that greater intake is associated with a greater instance and prevalence and risk of these diseases and conditions. However, we want to be incredibly careful to note that we don't know for sure if this is just a connection, so these happen to be happening at the same time, or that these foods are causing these diseases and conditions. Again, it's really important to make note of that. It's what's known in research as correlation versus causation. Just because they're happening at the same time doesn't mean one is causing the other. For example, could it be that the people who have a higher intake of ultra-processed foods are also more likely to have other lifestyle habits that are increasing their risk for these things? So maybe they're more likely to be sedentary, things like that just happen to also be putting them at risk for these things. So we don't know that for sure yet. I will say in full transparency, because we wanted to talk about the state of the research, there was an incredibly interesting study done just in 2019. It was a small study that suggested, didn't prove, but suggested that ultra-processed foods might potentially cause people to eat more because they're hyper palatable and therefore gain weight. But again, this was an incredibly small study. It was only 20 people. The people who did that research are continuing to look into this. They want to see, do we see this? Can we replicate this on a bigger scale with a more diverse population? But I'll say it's interesting. It's definitely a reason for for us all to keep an eye on this research. But until then, what we know there is a connection. There are a couple of exceptions I want to point out. So that would include ultra-processed whole grains and yogurt. When you're meeting your recommendations for whole grains or dairy through ultra-processed whole grains or yogurt, we actually see the flip. We actually see a reduction in things like stroke and heart disease. So again, no blanket statement can be made here, but certainly we do see at a high level that there is an increased risk with increased intake. So where that leaves us is asking some questions like, well, what are we eating? So we want to take a look at what we're doing kind of at a population level and start to use that to make some assessments of our own diet. So where we're at today, 60% of the calories in the US are coming from ultra-processed foods. So that means more than half of what we eat is ultra-processed foods, simply put. And those calories are largely coming from the foods you see here. So when you take a look at this list, you'll see that many of them are what you might consider those ultra-processed foods with low nutritional value, little intact food, little whole food left in those foods. And again, important to note that not all of these foods would necessarily carry the same level of risk. And if you've got whole grain versions of those cereals or breads, those are exceptions. But over half of our calories coming largely from these foods, cakes, cookies, pies, salty snacks. And on a daily basis, the highest intake that was linked with the risk of those diseases is about 7 servings per day. So here's where we're at. Over half of our calories coming from ultra-processed foods, largely from the foods that you see listed here, and up to 7 servings per day. So if you think about that, it's about 1 to 2 ultra-processed food per meal or eating occasion if you eat 3 times a day or a snack here and there. So what you do with this is you think to yourself, where do I fall in this picture? Do I see myself reflected in these numbers and in these foods? Do I think more than half of what I eat is coming from this cluster of foods that I'm having on a regular basis, and I'm eating them, multiple times a day? Multiple foods in my meals are ultra processed. So this is a reflection moment for you. You think to yourself, where am I at? And do I want to start to tick back on any of these things? If you do, where do you start? Right? There's a lot of different ways to do this, but we always think about small changes. Small changes are where it's at if you want to have lasting results that are realistic. So I would suggest maybe focusing first on the ultra-processed foods with low nutritional value. You don't have to, but it's an easy starting point for a lot of people. We're going to use a donut as an example. And don't worry, I'm not going to tell you not to eat your donut. I eat donuts, full disclosure. So if we think about a donut, what could we do with this that might make some positive changes that are small, that might improve our pattern of eating? Here's a couple ideas. Maybe you're going to emphasize whole or minimally processed foods alongside that donut. So maybe you're going to add some nice fruit to the side. Maybe you start with the fruit and maybe you'll eat less of the donut, but regardless, by adding that fruit, you're adding some protective components, protective nutrients that might even counteract some of that health risk. That's one thing you could do. Maybe you stick with this, and in addition, you're going to limit either the frequency, so how often you're having the donut, or you're going to have a smaller portion size. Another small change. And then maybe on top of that, you're going to actually address your habits around food. So you're going to think about, are you planning ahead enough so that you don't have to grab the donut if you don't want to? Or are you stocking up at home so that you have things on hand that give you kind of a similar eating experience, but maybe are a little bit more in line with the pattern of eating that you're after? So potentially maybe you're replacing the donut with something like our mini muffins, smaller portion size, and they actually offer, many of our mini muffins offer whole grain. So you can see how tiny little changes can truly shift your pattern. This is a far cry from this, but you could still have this, you could have this, you could do any number of things just to kind of get started, because the idea is not to throw everything out. It's to find ways to work with where you're starting, particularly if you have ultra-processed foods in your diet that you truly enjoy. And if you're looking for some added support, I wanted to highlight a few things that we have in terms of help on Wegmans.com. So first, before you go to the store, if you're making your shopping list, check out product ingredient statements. We have those listed online. You can take your time to kind of look and compare items, especially if you've got a particular product that you're just looking for maybe a different or less processed version of it. So definitely check out those ingredient statements. You could check out our recipes, which are chef developed. They're amazing. And see if maybe there's a few things that you want to try to get maybe in the kitchen more creating, because anytime you're cooking the food yourself, you're in control of the ingredients. It's not going to be ultra processed. And so that's one way too, that if you're looking to make some of the same great restaurant quality types of things on your own, that's a great way to kind of explore and make some shifts. And then on Wegmans.com/feel your best, we call that our Feel Your Best pages. Lots of great information there. And I'll draw your attention to a couple of sections that I think are truly helpful. Our balanced meals and nutrition section. There's information on building a balanced meal. So really kind of emphasizing different, multiple food groups with whole and minimally processed or whole and minimally processed foods. And then you'll see there also our whole body health section. If you were to go there, you'd find our healthy eating guidelines, which gives you an overview of a pattern of eating that supports good health and still leaves room for processed or ultra processed foods, but really helps to emphasize to shift the focus to those foods that are not ultra processed. And then on our lifestyle and habits page, we have a section on healthy eating habits that can really kind of help you get started with stocking for success, so that you are, ready with some of those items that support good health that maybe are not ultra processed. Eating plant foods, there's some information there under healthy eating habits. And then also our meal planning and shopping page, which is really wonderful. Lots of great tips for getting yourself set up, so that maybe you're not always in a situation where you're grabbing maybe a convenience food that happens to be ultra processed kind of out of desperation because, you found yourself stuck and didn't have a plan. So really great stuff there to dig in and to really kind of meet you where you are and to kind of, choose your own adventure in terms of what foods you want to start with and what types of small changes you might want to make. Because the takeaway here is quite simple. When we think about the research, absolutely, it is not nothing. There is a connection between ultra-processed foods and greater risk of health diseases and conditions. It's not nothing, but it's not everything. So really, we're not talking about a diet overhaul here. We're talking about shifting your pattern of eating. So we're shifting away from that 60% of calories, shifting away from some of those foods like the low nutritional value. So they're not as predominant in our pattern of eating, and maybe we're focusing more on some of the foods you might find in our healthy eating guidelines. And we're shifting away from that 7 servings a day, maybe closer to 5 or closer to 4. So truly, this is not, as I said at the beginning, an all or nothing thing. We don't want people to fear their food, but there's absolutely a reason to think about our personal intake and consider whether or not we want to make some small changes. So with that, I wanted to leave lots of time for questions. So I'm going to stop my presentation here and ask my friend Amber if you might come back and join me and let me know if we had any chatter out there. So thanks for listening, and let's see what types of questions we have.
All right. Before we go into our Q&A, please note that we do have a survey, and your feedback is incredibly valuable to us. The link for the survey can be found in the chat for our live participants and in the video description for those who are watching on demand. But we did get some really exciting, great questions, Kirby. One that we got was, when I use canned chickpeas in something like a salad, is that an ultra-processed food, or is that bad? Should I not do that?
Canned chickpeas in a salad. First of all, that sounds delicious, and I didn't eat lunch yet, and I might just have that. So in general, anytime we have a question about whether or not a food is considered ultra processed, I am not the expert on this. In fact, some of the research, there was a research study that they did, and they actually had a panel of people that would vote on whether or not a food would truly be considered ultra processed by NOVA standards. So full disclosure, I couldn't say yes or no there, and it would have to really look at the ingredients. So at the end of the day, though, we'd be asking things like, can you see the food in there, and does it count towards the food group? And if it does, even if it is technically considered ultra processed, that's an incredible solution for folks. Like I said, especially with the hummus. So what I heard is somebody described eating some beans and legumes with a nice plate full of veggies. So I think they said, is that considered good or bad? Is that the sentiment?
Yeah.
That sounds incredibly supportive of health, because it's including some whole foods that, like in the salad. And then whether or not the chickpeas, more likely than not, they're not ultra processed. But if did happen to be a few ingredients in there that would make them considered ultra processed, it's again one of those kind of similar to that hummus with artificial flavors. That's kind of like, it's still kind of counting towards those food group goals. So it sounds great to me.
Thank you. How do you bypass the temptation of ultra processed foods?
That's a good one. So let's definitely recognize the fact that these are very prevalent. We're very much surrounded by processed and ultra processed foods. So there's a couple things that kind of come to mind. And one is that idea I said kind of earlier about kind of stocking yourself up for success. So making sure you have some things on hand that if you're feeling a temptation, you have something that is an option for you. If you decide, I really don't want to have this thing, I want to maybe make a different decision, you got to make sure the food is actually there. So that's one thing. Another thing is kind of similar to that fruit pairing that I talked about with the donut, is to not, make it into a restricted food, because we see a lot of things that can happen when we restrict foods. So it could be that you're kind of not giving into the temptation, but maybe you're allowing that, but you're making a choice that kind of bolsters the nutrition of that choice. But then lastly, I would also note that I think I mentioned that these foods tend to be hyperpalatable, which just means they taste really good, and they might even make it difficult for us to sense our fullness cues. So there's a couple things I would say there. One is that taste is kind of a learned sense. So we can actually unlearn our affinity for certain tastes. So if we're trying to eat things that are less salty, even over the course of 2 weeks, if we just kind of gradually reduce that intake, we'll start to get the same satisfaction from less salty foods. So certainly that could pertain to these kind of hyperpalatable foods. But the other thing I would say is to just kind of slow down. So if you are going to eat it, to kind of slow down and allow yourself ample time to feel that that fullness come through, because that is kind of what we were seeing in some of that one research study that I saw, that hyperpalatability, we might want to try to override it with some of those habits, like slowing down and potentially gradually ratcheting back some of those, the saltiness and the sugar and things like that. So a couple things you can do there. Hopefully that's helpful.
Awesome. Thanks, Kirby. I think we have time for one more question.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about the benefits of the food you feel good about label and how that works with ultra processed foods?
Fabulous question. So for folks that aren't aware, food you feel good about is on our Wegmans brand products. And it really just speaks to certain ingredients that are not allowed. So, and you can go to our website. There's on our Feel Your Best page, there's a link for Wegmans brand, and you can actually read the full definition for food you feel good about. But the connection to that and ultra processed foods is really that there is not one, or ultra processed ingredients, because food you feel good about is not based on the level of processing. It's based on whether or not something is considered an artificial flavor, color, or preservative, and there's a few other things that we consider. So there are potentially some ingredients that could be considered ultra processed allowed in our Food You Feel Good About brand. But the benefit of that really is that, one, we're very transparent about the ingredients that we allow in our brand, and we offer such a wide spectrum of choice because different ingredients are important to different people for different reasons. So the true benefit of that is that we really value choice here, and we try to be very transparent and communicate what our ingredients are under our Food You Feel Good About banner. So great question.
Awesome. Thank you, Kirby. Thank you so much for all this wonderful information, and thanks everybody for joining. We hope that you all have a wonderful day and that you feel your best.
Thank you.